Hi, everybody. This is Kevin Lynch with the Sero Project, and welcome to The Only Thing You Have to Lose Is Your Chains. And our presenters today are Breanna Diaz and Andy Spieldenner, and I'll be sharing my screen. And I will turn it over to Andy and Breanna.
Hi. Awesome.
Hello, everybody.
I'm so sorry. Let me have our wonderful interpreters go through our language justice files so folks can choose either English or Spanish. Okay, I'll give you my version of how to use interpretation services on Zoom. And unfortunately, I won't be able to do it in Spanish. But the next slide, I'll leave up for a few seconds so you can see the instructions. If you're on a laptop, you can choose the globe button down near the bottom of the screen. You click that, and you can choose either English or Spanish, whichever language you would like to listen in. And if you're on a device or a tablet, you can click on the three dots and then hit language interpretation, and then choose the language you would like to listen in. My slide deck's not. Okay. And here is the Spanish version of the same slide. All right. Sorry again, Andy and Breanna, please go ahead.
No worries at all. Language justice is important. Please ping us in the chat if y'all are having any issues with interpretation or if we're talking too fast. We can see the chat. But yeah, hi, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining this session by Health Not Prisons Collective on the last day of virtual HINEC. Our session today is titled "The Only Thing We Have to Lose Is Our Chains," and it's a community conversation on HIV criminalization and abolition. So we won't be the only ones talking today. You all will be talking as well. Next. Oh, sorry, Andy.
No, I just welcome everybody. And we actually built this to have some discussion and then some breakout rooms. So Breanna is correct. We are going to make y'all talk because this is a conversation. So we've done the introductions and the Health Not Prisons Collective is comprised of 5 organizations. Positive Women's Network USA, Sero Project, Transgender Law Center, the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and the Counter Narrative Project. Next slide. I think we go to the next slide. Cool. So who we are. I'm Andy Spieldenner. I know some of you, and I look forward to getting to know the rest of you. I am the vice chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus, and I'm the executive director of an organization called Impact Global Action for Gay Men's Health and Rights. Breanna, and I'm a person openly living with HIV.
Yeah, hey y'all. So my name is Breanna Diaz, and my pronouns are she and they. And I'm the policy director for Positive Women's Network USA, as well as a Health Not Prisons Collective member. So really brief agenda. We just want to lay out what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with who Health Not Prisons Collective is. Maybe some of y'all have heard of this name before, or maybe, you know, interacted with us, but we are fairly new. So we're going to share a little bit more about ourselves. We're going to talk about why abolition is a public health goal. And why Health Not Prisons believes it is, you know, a goal we should all aspire to. And then we'll have a community discussion. We have guiding questions where Andy and I will each facilitate a breakout room. And we will end with a report back and sharing of like our community and collective vision on how abolition can inform how we do our HIV criminalization work. And then there will also be opportunities to get involved with HNPC. Next slide. Do you want to do this one, Andy, or you want me?
Trying to figure out the buttons on my computer. I apologize, people. I am double booked, so I'm also participating in a meeting with USAID. Okay. So who we are as a collective, we were launched in 2020. We started talking in 2019, the 5 organizations, and talking about what could we do? What would we want out of a movement to really end criminalization in HIV? And what are we concerned about that's not being addressed by others in the space? And one of the things that's happened, you know, one of the things that we realized was that a lot of these criminalization conversations are happening and all of this, the movements happening without really centering people living with HIV. Sometimes we advise, sometimes we write the law, sometimes we're able to participate, but we rarely get to frame the whole discussion. And so the 5 groups came together as 5 very constituent-based groups. All of us have as members either a large number of people living with HIV or we are a people living with HIV organization. And so we really wanted to we thought, what could we do? What would be effective for us, for what's not being done for us? And think about how we can do it by us. And so we approached a funder with a ambitious 3-year plan that they agreed to, and that funder was Gilead Pharmaceuticals. We wanted to look particularly at how HIV criminalization, we can center it in the ideas of racial justice. We all took on different parts. So there's educational components, there's advocacy components, there's actually law change components, and there's narrative shift, which is when you really like look at the culture and what the discourses are around HIV criminalization and work to change it so that it's not about the HIV predator, you know, which is like the common one, right? Like we're people living with HIV and we are a danger to everybody and people have to be protected by us. You know, one of the things that happens in the gay community, for those people who don't know, is that on those social media apps like Grindr, those sex apps, there are occasionally like these groups that get together that decide to out people's HIV status, and they'll say, "Oh, these are false. These are people with HIV, and be wary of them, and they're evil." Blah blah blah. And what we want to do is change that, so that's not a socially acceptable thing to do, so that people don't think they're doing the community a favor. So people actually can be told like that's not an acceptable thing. And so all of us are taking on different components and we're working across all of the collective to get it done. Now, what's obviously stymied some of the organizing has been the pandemic for the last 1.5 years. So we got the funding at the beginning of 2020, the shutdowns happened in March, right? So we have pivoted and we're still working. The part of what we're doing now is to create a community conversation. Breanna?
I have nothing to add. That was a perfect summary of who we are. Next slide, I think we have more. Oh, yeah. So I can just keep going off of this slide. So Health Not Prisons, as Andy said, he explained, who we are, why we formed, and gave a really good example of how like criminalization impacts our mindset and how we actually interact with one another within community. And we really want to dismantle that. Like when we talk about HIV criminalization work, a lot of that conversation is always, I think, is always centered on legislation. Like there is a concrete thing that we need to address, typically a bill. But when we talk about HIV criminalization, we're talking about stigma, we're talking about discrimination, and we're talking about like interpersonal dynamics and community dynamics as well. And so that's the work that HNP also wants to address. Yes, legislative work, legal work, but we want to change the way we talk about criminalization. And so how we plan on doing that is that we will significantly advance HIV decriminalization efforts in at least 8 priority states. Those states have included Virginia, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, California, South Carolina, and Pennsylvania and Texas. And those states are always changing because so much change has happened just this past session. So many of the states have modernized, repealed their laws. So we got to probably change our 8 states. But we also want to develop a network of Black attorneys to address HIV decriminalization, as we all know that there's not really a great network of attorneys that folks who are experiencing HIV criminalization, sex work decriminalization, or drug use criminalization can rely on. There's not real like literacy and understanding of this issue in the legal community and how to really like work with folks who are criminalized and advocate on behalf of their clients in a real and meaningful and competent, like culturally competent way. So we want to create that network. Easy lift, right? We also want to elevate HIV criminalization as a priority for intersecting movement groups focused on mass incarceration and policing. I know a lot of folks on here are very familiar with this call to action, right? Like when we talk about HIV criminalization, we are, oh, I see interpreter has their hand raised. I'm assuming I'm talking too fast. Do I need to address that hand raise? Okay, yes, sorry, I get really excited. So when we talk for number 3, when we're talking about intersecting movements, we know that when we talk about HIV criminalization, we are also talking about sex work criminalization and drug use criminalization and any other type of criminalization, because who is most impacted by HIV criminalization laws are the most marginalized folks in the HIV community, right? It is sex workers. We've seen that time and time again in multiple William Report studies and anecdotally from folks' own experience. We know that we cannot end the HIV epidemic in a real meaningful way unless we're addressing every part like every community touched by criminalization. And we want to deploy a compelling cultural productions and media interventions that shift narratives of blame and punishment. Andy gave a real good example of that, of like our own folks like policing, surveilling, and outing people, thinking that they're doing a service and protecting people when they're actually putting folks in danger and taking away autonomy and power and reinforcing just mass criminalization and incarceration. Like, that's not what we're about. We're not gonna criminalize ourselves out of criminalization. Like, I don't get that. That's just me though. And finally, we want to sustain a robust grassroots decriminalization response that centers and elevates leadership by impacted communities, including Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, people living with HIV, LGBTQ people, sex workers, and immigrant and migrant populations. Again, we know who's impacted by HIV criminalization, and we cannot respond to this issue unless we center, include, and follow the leadership of those most impacted. Andy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the goals of the collective, and I love that people are talking about all the changes that the laws are happening, and we're all excited, and it's really great. And we have more to do in criminalization because, like, one of the conversations, as we talk about our goals and our work in the collective, one of the things that people I had one interaction where somebody asked, is this HIV criminalization that you're talking about or criminalization? And I had to point out that to a trans sex worker living with HIV, they're the same thing. And that's one of the reasons we have to really look at the whole constellation of the prison industrial complex and how it interacts on people's bodies and in communities. Because we get, for somebody who gets picked up for suspicion of solicitation, and then they find out they have HIV, the HIV law is being used to make it a felony. So we have to kind of keep on making the conversation larger, and HYNAC is a great space to start making it bigger so that we can go back to our communities and say, the law is one problem, but there's 900 others, and we can still work on them.
HNPs, we're just all amazing at identifying problems. We're just great. Next slide. So Andy and I talked about who we are, what our aspirations are that we all will achieve together. And so I'm briefly going to share some of the work that we've done so far, that we've done through a pandemic. And that, as a community nationwide, I'm still blown away that we've been able to do so much and build so much during a damn pandemic. But yeah, some work that we've done includes supporting state coalitions, leading HIV criminalization, legislative advocacy campaigns, such as the best, I'm not biased or anything, ECHO VA out in Virginia to modernize their state law. So as you all probably have heard already, or maybe heard in the session earlier this week, Virginia successfully modernized their HIV criminalization law this last session. Senate Bill 1138 modernized Virginia's HIV criminalization law, adding specific intent to transmit, actual transmission must occur, engaging in behaviors that engaging in sexual behaviors that carry a risk of transmission. Previously, the law would criminalize oral sex, and we know that's not a thing, and did so much more. All that success in Virginia is due entirely to Dr. Cedric Pullman and Deirdre Johnson for their leadership in pulling this table together, and leading a strategy that led to modernizing a horribly outdated, terrible law in Virginia. And HNP and PWN and Sero and all of us were just proud to be a part of it and support their work and yell at people for being annoying. Happy to do that with ECHO VA. We've also, the Transgender Law Center has released and is always updating their trans agenda for liberation, which is a phenomenal call to action. I highly recommend everyone on here read to know what liberation looks like, right? I think Andy did a great job of saying sure, check mark the bill, but what more do we have to do to address the root causes of HIV, of criminalization and how it shows up? We have to address all 900 problems, not just the one. And I think the trans agenda for liberation really highlights what that action needs to look like, and that it needs to be trans-led, trans-centered, especially by Black, Indigenous, and other trans folks of color, and how as allies we can show up and incorporate that call into our day-to-day work. We've also done a lot of work on molecular HIV surveillance, which I'm sure you heard Andy and others talk about on Monday. That has also been a huge campaign that we are proud to lead and be a part of. And finally, I wanted to uplift a piece of the Counter Narrative Project's work, where they are doing that narrative justice work, right? Shifting how we talk about HIV criminalization, talking about stigma, that folks have a right to sexual pleasure and all that stuff. Just because you're living with HIV doesn't mean you can't live that, enjoy your life. And it's really important that when we talk about HIV criminalization, how it impacts someone's autonomy and existence, their happiness and ability to seek pleasure. And so Counter Narrative is just excelling at that work. And I'm going to share some articles in the chat throughout this because they're good reads. Andy, did you want to add anything? Okay, next.
So why abolition? You know, you may have heard abolition before. And, you know, we live in a country that, well, the US is a country, I say that because I live in Guadalajara, but the US is a country that has a very large prison industrial complex, and that many of the social tools that we're encouraged to use are related to law enforcement. And one of the things I want to point out, and I say this as somebody, every semester I ask my students I also teach at a school, I ask my students, who are you calling when you call 911? And they actually don't realize that it's usually co-located in a police department, the actual 911 unit. And the reason I bring that up is because about 90 to 95% of 911 calls are nonviolent, and yet they're going to the police department. And so as we've seen over time, can we go back one? As we've seen over the last, you know, in all of our lifetimes, we've seen that police escalate conflicts often. They don't have a lot of ways to de-escalate, which can lead to lots of harms, including loss of life. And so one of the things that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a big abolition activist, says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. So when we see things like defund the police, you know, people get like, oh, well, who are you going to call when you're in an emergency? 95% of 911 calls are nonviolent. You know, why are they? And so what we're seeing is that, you know, we are asking, because we understand that the prison industrial complex interacts with us very differently depending on our identity. If we're Black, Brown, Indigenous, if we're sex workers, if we're people who use drugs, people of trans experience, people with mental health issues, the institutions interact with us very differently. Not surprisingly, same populations heavily disproportionately impacted by HIV. I always call it the criminal processing system, not the criminal justice system. So that's just, so you know, I call it criminal processing. It prevents people from different kinds of access. So when you're in prison and you have a felony conviction, you have different kinds of access to healthcare. You can no longer vote when you get out. You know, it's hard to get a job. It's very hard to explain a felony conviction on a job application. And many people won't. Many employers won't hire people with a criminal record. And we know this. Like, I'm not saying this as a surprise. But when we think about that, if we think about that, then this presents a public health crisis, that we are imprisoning so many people. In the city of Baltimore, for instance, it's close to half of all African-American men have been arrested. And it's shocking, but it is a public health crisis, and that's something that we should think about. When we talk about police reform, often those are just reinvesting in the same systems. They're not actually creating change. There might be a representation change, like suddenly there's a gay liaison officer or something, or an African-American community liaison, but it doesn't create any structural change in the way policing happens or the way that the rest of the criminal processing system works. We've seen this year that New York Pride has said that they no longer will be, that they're banning New York NYPD and other law enforcement agencies from participating in Pride because of the historical and current discriminatory practices that impact the LGBTQ community. So to give an example, after the Pulse shooting that happened a few years ago, and we're coming up on the anniversary of it, but after the Pulse shooting, NYPD decided to heavily patrol gay bars in New York. And the people they chose to give problems to that were trying to go into the gay bars were Black and Latino, because they saw them as dangerous, not that they were part of the community. And so there was a big uproar. NYPD had to stop having police at gay bar doors because it was a problem. And so we've seen prides are starting. NYPD is probably, New York Pride is the biggest one that said no more cops out of Pride. But we also are seeing several jurisdictions creating social work teams and other kinds of intervention teams for nonviolent 911 calls. And that should be applauded. So when we hear defund the police, it's a larger set of issues that we're talking about. And so we bring this to you today to really be able to talk about what would abolition look like in the HIV criminalization space. You know, is it about changing laws? Like, what would need to change? What is your vision for moving forward around how do we create a society? What would it mean in HIV criminalization? What would abolition mean? Breanna, did you want to jump in?
I mean, like, I feel like we could talk for like more than an hour on this, like all of our thoughts and feelings. So like, yes, I do. And like, it's like everything you've said, right? Like I'm always stuck with how criminalization has always been used as a response to public health epidemics and beyond, violent or nonviolent, right? Like there is something at its root that is just unethical, immoral, evil, wrong, and has done nothing more but keep us like in our chains, right? Like the title of like our own presentation. And we need to do more as advocates. I firmly believe we as a movement need to do more to address like how criminalization shows up in our work beyond HIV criminalization. Like Andy said earlier, like, are you talking about HIV criminalization or criminalization? Like there's layers to this. Like what is our true goal in doing this work? Like does like incarceration serve us? Does policing, surveillance, like how has it ever served us? It hasn't. So why do we continue to engage with a system that wants nothing more than to keep us oppressed? So I'm done with my rant. I don't know, Andy, if you had anything more to add.
No, just time check. This ends at what time?
4:15 Eastern.
4:15. So we do have time for breakouts. Yay, we made it to a breakout.
Did it. Let me get the questions in the chat. So we're going to be putting folks in 2 different breakout rooms, and we're going to talk together through some questions Andy and I came up with, because we want to hear from you all. Like our voices are really important, but y'all's I guess are more important. So I'd love to hear from everyone. But here are the questions we'll be addressing.
Nick, I love your pick, by the way, for your profile. I just have to say that out loud.
So if you're all ready, I'm going to put everyone into rooms.
Perfect. Thank you. Hey folks, welcome back.
Cool, welcome back.
Is everyone here? Are we all back together?
Think so.
If they're not here, they're not gonna stand up and say it.
Yes, everyone's
Um,
I'm sorry.
How was your room, Andy? What did y'all talk about?
Well, we talked about lots of things and people comment. No, just kidding. This is actually my first day wearing glasses, everybody. I finally got to the point where I could no longer read and I got glasses. So, but nobody commented on it. So I'm not gonna hold it against them. But we had a really good conversation. And I really appreciate everybody participating in the breakout rooms and the conversation we were able to have. A lot of times at HYNAC, we have the, especially in these online spaces and all these meetings, we want to do more interactive stuff. So I really appreciate people being willing to participate and going into the breakout sessions. So our group overall, I'm going to start with one of the last things that was said, which I think is brilliant. Katie talked about abolition as evolution. And really looking at kind of like, evolving the way people think about these systems and these processes and our recourses. And I think, when we talk about, then the group started talking about the different community resources that need to happen for real abolition in the criminalization space. So looking at jobs, housing, education, and that kind of resourcing so that people have options. Then we had a long talk about punitive systems. So everything from health surveillance to school policing to how policing happens and looking at how people automatically assume certain kinds of people are criminals and then the police are more likely to intervene. People brought up the fact that disease intervention specialists, that interview that happens when you're first diagnosed with HIV, where that suddenly you realize that you're no longer a person, that you are a number in a government system that says, I'm not just Andy, I'm HIV Andy. And how all of those systems, how camera systems are part of it. And also like how the private sector funds a lot of it because then people make a lot of money and that has to be dismantled too. And people talked about sentencing and the impact of criminalization, how people lose their licenses, their employment, and how any movement to abolition has to look at reinstating people's rights and getting records expunged. So that's kind of, we talked about a lot. Do people want to jump in, or Breanna, why don't you give group two's, your groups, report back?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Yeah, so we talked a lot about first we started off with how do we define abolition? It is such a lofty theoretical idea. And so we had a conversation about what is abolition? And then, what is realistic, realistic, undoing systems like mass incarceration is generational work. And we recognize that. And so talking about what is realistic versus what is the ideal we aspire to. And that conversation is really similar to the work that folks do in HIV modernization versus HIV repeal work, right? That is I feel like that's where abolition shows up in our day-to-day talks of our work of HIV crim is why do we pursue one route over the other? Because it's almost like harm reduction. But one is more in line with abolition and one is still participating in criminalization to some degree. And then we talked about when we talk about abolition, we talk about what did that mean? And we talked it as it's freedom to move Like we know folks living with HIV and like folks rely on certain services, like don't have freedom of movement, right? Like if they're dependent on certain services or community, like based on your status or race, sexual orientation, gender identity, like you don't really have freedom to move. And then we talked about freedom from discrimination and stigma, as both are reinforced in the criminal justice system or injustice system. And we talked about freedom from papers. Like folks raised how like the amount of paperwork that they have to fill out or get, and like based on their status and like getting labs and like what burden that paperwork comes with, and like the stigma and like any negative emotions associated with it, like it raises, was big. And then we also talked about like when we talk about abolition, we have to include the conversation in the fight for reparations. Like when we're talking about funding and supporting services or folks, like we cannot dismantle these messed up systems without also talking about reparations and advocating fiercely for them. And I'll stop there. We also talked about like no to sex offender registries, like within at least the HIV criminalization context. We got to unpack more about sex offender registries generally at a later point. And we also addressed how pinkwashing shows up in criminalization conversations. I'll stop there if anyone from group 2 wants to add more.
So true, Susan, so true. Yeah, do people want to jump in? We have time for one person to jump in. Cool, I think our last slide is the next one. I think it's how to get involved with the Health Not Prisons Collective. We brought this conversation because one of the things that I think is really important when we're talking in these spaces is we have to have these community conversations about ideas like abolition and what is modernization, what is repeal, because we need to, as a community, like we just need more spaces, and HYNAC gives us these great spaces where the community's all together, where we can just share ideas and beliefs. This isn't about what's right and what's wrong, although abolition is what's right, but it is about kind of like doing some conversations and learning. I think we can all learn from each other in this space, and in the criminalization space. So thank you for taking part in this community conversation. This is how to get involved with the Health Not Prisons Collective update, or Health Not Prisons Collective listserv. Breanna, closing statements?
Yeah, I mean, just thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I know abolition is like sometimes feels like murky. Like folks always ask, like, so what does that mean? Like, can you just give me a definition? I know I struggle with providing one because it's like, it's an ideal. And I understand that, yeah, it's idealistic. Like dismantling like hundreds of thousands of years of oppression is going to take time. But doing, I think, that inner work that shows up in our outer advocacy and like how we treat each other, like how we interact, that can be rooted in abolition, and we can hopefully reach those idealistic goals. And so I just want to say thank you so much for like engaging. And I think what can be a difficult conversation for many, it's difficult for me at times. And like, I hope that you're able to get involved with HNP, just stay up to date to learn more about our work and tell us how like we can support y'all's work. And I'm just grateful.
Abolition is a conversation that all of us can be part of. All of us have city councils that determine funding. All of us, when I'm in the US, I live in San Diego, and the city council, even though the police did not request an increase in funding, the city council gave them an increase in funding. And so there are things like that where you're like, let's not deal with people who are homeless and providing housing. Let's just give more money to the police who didn't even ask for more money. And so I think that we all need to take a part and say like that, like, no, this goes to social services. This goes to changing policy around housing. This goes to education. And I think we can all be part of that story. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we made it on time.
Thanks, everybody. This was a great session. Thank you so much, Breanna and Andy. And I guess we will see each other at the last closing preliminary. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay.